So I actually got into corruption not as an American trying to impose, the various, how to put it, values that Americans love to impose on other people and not themselves. But I went to Afghanistan after 9/11 to first to cover, I was at the time a journalist, the fall of the Taliban. And then it was like, shut up already and do something, like try to take some responsibility for the story you've been covering. So I ended up staying for 10 years. And it was Afghans who came to me with the issue of corruption. So everything I know about corruption, I've really learned from ordinary Afghans and the difficulties that they were experiencing with their government, which was, incidentally, the government that was being supported by the United States and the rest of the international community. So it was so then that's how I ended up being an advisor, was trying to convey the concerns of Afghans to American decision makers. And I was trying to explain to to America and eventually my superiors, if you don't address the corruption problem, you're going to lose the war. I rest my case. But let me talk a little bit more broadly. So that's really where I learned kind of what I know. And then I went to a number of other places to see whether what applied to Afghanistan applied to them. And from Nigeria to Uzbekistan to Nepal to Honduras, I found very, very similar patterns. But before we get into corruption per se, I want to talk about something else. That stuff. That stuff. I get it. We all need it. But at certain periods of history, it becomes not just a means of exchange, something through which we're able to obtain the things we need for a dignified life. Instead, it becomes the marker of social standing. So no longer is it your judgment or your level of education or your generosity or how you serve your fellow citizens that gets you, ahead in society. It's how much of that stuff you have. And the problem with that is that there's no such thing as enough. When money is the marker of social standing, then you can't ever have enough because somebody else has more and you have to beat them and then you have to beat them and you have to beat them. And there's another issue about this stuff. The thing is, that's pretty old-fashioned to throw paper around, right? What we're really using now, right, means it's infinitely, storable. In the old days, wealth was counted not in paper, but in sheep, fig trees, forest, timber. But if your wealth is in your forest, you have to tend that forest, right? It's not just a wild thing that, you're careful about which trees you cut, right? You don't want to cut the finest trees. You want to leave them in the forest to produce more fine trees. If you have flocks of sheep, you actually need to take care of them. So there's an effort and almost a love that has to go into tending that kind of wealth. And that's what you could call ordinary wealth. This stuff is entirely different. On the contrary, to amass more and more of this stuff, you actually often have to damage or destroy the basis from which it comes. You mine the earth, you clear cut the forest, you traffic in wild animals, and you actually destroy, you kill the goose, right, that's laying the golden eggs. So that is in this time when money is the yardstick that measures social standing. It's not the same across history. We're living in one of those periods right now. I would say, based on what I've heard from people in 6 or 7 different countries, it starts around 1980, roughly. But between World War II and 1980, money didn't have that same incredible, almost dominant, almost autocratic power in society as it does today. Okay. So in a period in which money plays that role, corruption follows close behind, typically. What do I mean by corruption? I'm not talking about, right, a single transaction between 2 people where I'm in Parliament and, my friend over here wants me not to bring the lobbying act up for a vote, right? And so he pays me an envelope. That's a very, very narrow understanding of what corruption is. I would suggest, and how I've seen it play out in so many different countries, it's a kind of operating system of very sophisticated networks. And I'd like to pause on that for a moment, because again, I got my understanding of corruption from a country that almost everyone would consider a failing country, Afghanistan, right? So we talk about a weak state or a failing state, and there's a lot of international, attention paid to fragile and failing states. And I would often say in those communities, well, the state may be failing as a state, but that's because the ruling networks aren't interested in governing. They're interested in something else. They're interested in enriching their members. And so the state is failing, but the network is succeeding. It's succeeding in making a killing, in enriching itself. And I think that's a valuable way to understand, to think about anyway, countries where there is systemic corruption. Who's getting rich? Who's, succeeding in their objectives while your country is failing? And let me tell you, I live near Washington, D.C., the capital of the United States. And in the last 20, 30 years, there has been this explosion of what we call McMansions, these houses that are huge. You'd never see a house like that in Europe, right? These huge houses where a nuclear family lives of 2 parents and 2 kids. So it's not the countryside because they live fairly close to the next huge. Anyway, who lives in those McMansions? Defense contractors, pharmaceutical executives. In New York, you have the finance industry. You've got the fossil fuel industry living in similar houses, usually in Texas. And now let me just take you through some recent events in the United States. You had an economic crash in 2008, which I think you all experienced the repercussions of. 2 lost wars, Iraq and Afghanistan, 2 wars that the United States lost, a global pandemic, that I'm not sure anyone can say the United States did well in terms of the number of deaths of our citizens, and, global warming, provided to you all thanks in large part to the US fossil fuel industry. So objectively, is the United States not a failing state? I mean, these are failures. This is 5 or 6 failures. And yet, look at the well-being and look at the incomes of the executives of the businesses that are very closely interlinked to government in those areas. So interlinked to government, that's really what I want to get at in terms of how corruption operates. It is the operating system of an integrated network, which includes public officials, members of private, executives or members of the board of private businesses, and often out and out criminals. And what these networks do is they exchange their personnel so that somebody might be, at the top of a defense contracting company like Lockheed, or this again, I'm using US examples, but these large defense contracting. And then the next day he is the Secretary of the Army. And then 2 years later, he's back out in the defense industry again. So we in American English call that the revolving door. Do you have an expression like that in Latvian? No, you do? Yeah. The problem with that expression, and tell me if it's the same in Latvian, is it suggests that it's one individual pushing a revolving door. What I'm trying to suggest is this is how the networks function. They deliberately exchange personnel. That's how they weave. I've been looking at some beautiful flax, linen, right? And the weaving of the linen, the network weaves itself in a similar way by exchanging people. So there's also vertical integration. I don't think that's as big a problem probably here as it is in a place like Afghanistan or Nigeria or Uzbekistan, where for your child to graduate from college, you have to give something to the professor, right? To get the surgeon to look at your sister who needs, who has breast cancer, you have to give the surgeon a little something. Or the police who shake you down at the road, oh, you have a light out, the back light of your car is out. So they can either give you a ticket for 50 euros, or you can give them a little 10 euros and they won't give you the ticket. I don't know if that happens here. Does it? It does? It used to. So what I suggest is that 10 euros that maybe you used to have to or be able to give to the police officer, that police officer probably didn't keep all of it. He might have kept 5, and 5 goes up the line. At least that's how it works in Afghanistan, in Nigeria, and Uzbekistan. Those extorted bribes go up the line, and in return, impunity comes down. So, and I learned this in Afghanistan while I watched President Karzai stop anti-corruption prosecutions of trivial, unimportant people. And I couldn't understand, why is he, risking his own reputation, doing something the international community would get angry at, to protect some nobody? And the answer is that's the deal. And he needed to show everybody in the network that he was going to uphold his side of the bargain so that they would continue paying the money upwards. So that's the vertical integration. The horizontal integration, I think you've had a major public official here who was on the board of directors of the biggest bank in Latvia. Is that not the case? Okay, okay. That's horizontal integration, right? Or was it a finance minister? Somebody, I meant to ask Ines, who she mentioned it. Sorry? Bank of Latvia, and who was the public official? Who was in what position? But what public position was he in the government? Oh, it's a public entity. No, but I thought there was someone who was a political figure who was also on the board of a major bank.
Well, not the case earlier in the 2000s with Anders Bergman. He was on the board of Parex. I think I had some memory of that.
Yeah. So,
And then he became prime minister.
But this is what I mean, right? By horizontal integration, it's when someone has a foot in public office and also a foot in the private sector, or is spinning from one to the other. And then there's trafficking. I would submit that, I mean, out and out criminal behavior. I would submit that where you have rampant organized crime, like Honduras, for example, where I've done quite a bit of work, it will turn out that government officials, their brothers or their sons-in-law or something like that, will have major roles in the criminal trafficking organization. So right now, the country of Honduras extradited its past president to the United States because he was involved in drug trafficking. My question is, why do you wait until after he's no longer president to indict him? I mean, why did the United States wait? Sends an awkward message, which is, if you lose power, then you're subject to indictment, right? But so this is what I mean by horizontal integration. You can see how, again, we're in a business school, right? So authorizations to conduct certain types of business, if you have that type of connections between certain business executives and the government, they often get authorizations more easily than ordinary people do, right? This is a port city. Port cities, right. I see people grinning. Okay. But the really important thing I think to understand is that the role of members of these corrupt network who are in government. I mean, we hear about, oh, did they have their hands in the, you know, in the cookie jar, as we like to say, and did they serve themselves? And they do that. I mean, in the United States, we had a government minister under President Trump who actually took mattresses out of the residence and took them home. I mean, you know, so there can be that. President Trump himself very much dealt, what he did was have, for example, diplomatic events in his private properties, the Mar-a-Lago estate, or the, you know, he's got these big hotels. And that meant that if you have, for example, the, you know, and I'm trying to think who it was, in fact, you know, the Prime Minister of Japan, there's a whole retinue that comes. All of them are paying money to Trump's private business. Meanwhile, all of the Secret Service, they have to stay there at $200-300 a night or more, all of the food, all of that, all of those purchases are going directly to Trump's private business. That's the self-serving side of corruption, and it exists, and it's scandalous and all of that. That's important. What about procurement? And here we're back to business, right? When a business belongs to a family member or a crony of a government minister who is in charge of the procurement, or if that government minister knows that they will get a job in that contractor's hierarchy after they're out of office, and then they favor that business in government procurement contracts, that's another way that members of government serve the network, right? Instead of serving the population. But maybe the most important way is in writing the rules in such a way that they will benefit the corrupt networks and not benefit the people. So, I mean, a glaring example of this in the United States is our inability to gain any ethics legislation that would oversee the behavior of members of our Congress, right, of our National Assembly. You've just gotten a lobbying law in this country. We don't have one. I mean, we have some, but you know, I can't wait. I've not compared the details of the Latvian law with the US law, but I think yours is better than ours. And even the definition of corruption, for my most recent book, which is on corruption in America, I looked at Supreme Court cases on the issue of corruption since 1987. And they have been narrowing and narrowing and narrowing and narrowing the legal definition of corruption until it's so narrow that basically you are worthy of going to jail for stupidity if you can actually be prosecuted for it. I mean, it is so precise. To the point, so we've just come from a reception at the Irish embassy, and a gentleman from the US embassy was there. And I said, are you still in the public integrity beat? Because I know so many prosecutors who have left the public integrity department at the Department of Justice, the US Department of Justice, because they can't make any cases. One of them told me, you have to be a really bad criminal to get prosecuted. He said, I don't mean a dangerous criminal. I mean someone who's really bad at being a criminal. You have to be stupid. That is the key issue that deserves attention when you're talking about a systemically corrupt situation, is how are the rules being bent in effect to legalize corruption? Consequences. I got into, and I'm going to pick up one question that has come to me from some of you, but then we're going to make it a little bit more lively. I'm going to, you know, drag you into it. But I got into this because I was living in Kandahar, Afghanistan, which was the, you know, not the birthplace. It was the former capital of the Taliban. And I got there in 2002 and nobody liked the Taliban. By 2005 or 6, people were starting to get sympathetic again. And I was hearing from Americans that this was about ideology, it was about culture, it was about Islam versus the West, it was about all of these, right, culture war issues. But what I was hearing from Afghans was that it was about corruption. That the government that the US and the international community was supporting was shaking them down, was stealing from them. And people would tell me the Taliban steal from us at night and the government steals from us in the daytime. What are we supposed to do? You know, like, why are we supposed to support a government that is hostile to our interests against the Taliban? And oh, by the way, when the Taliban were last in power, they were oppressive, but at least they were just. They're not now, but they were then. So I found that people were turning to religious extremism in their indignation against corruption. I went to Nigeria, and have you heard of Boko Haram? Yeah, same thing. I went to northern Nigeria and started interviewing people about what Boko Haram was doing in the beginning. They were going after the police, and the police were robbing us every day. We were happy in the beginning with Boko Haram. The church, I read on the map, the cathedral, that it's a Lutheran church. Is that correct? Yeah. Is there a Lutheran community here in Latvia? Okay. So have you read the 95 Theses recently? Go back and read them. Go back and read them. It is like 87 of them are about corruption. It's about being able to pay in order to release your relatives from purgatory. It's corruption. You're buying, you know, the church was at the time was essentially, and the reason for it was that a German prelate wanted to add a third bishopric. He was already bishop in 2 different places, and he wanted to add a third, and he needed to pay the Pope a certain amount of money. And so he launched a sale of indulgences so that he could gather the money to buy his position from the Pope. It's all about corruption. And oh, by the way, the Reformation was not a calm event. It was extremist, puritanical religion. So I don't quite want to compare Osama bin Laden with Martin Luther, but there's actually more parallels there than you might imagine. So that's one thing that happens. What about the Arab Spring? What about the 2014 revolution in Ukraine? What were they about? We have a tendency with Ukraine to think in East-West terms. But if you go back and look at what people were furious about in Ukraine, it's corruption. It was the corruption of the Yanukovych regime. In my country, we elected, I'm sorry, if you don't call what happened in 2016 extreme voting, extremist voting, that's what I call it. And I think you see it in some places in Europe too. And it's counterintuitive because you say, how could people indignant at corruption vote for somebody who was way more corrupt even than the other candidate? But when people are really, really furious, they want to break something more than, they're not choosing brands of toothpaste anymore. They want to blow the system up. And I think that explains the Trump vote. And I think it explains a lot of the votes, even in Europe, for people who you might call extreme candidates. I've heard about Belarus and migrants. Is that an issue? So why do you think those migrants left their homes? Where are they from? Places like Nigeria, Iraq. Okay, so Iraq, it's as much corruption as it is war-torn. I mean, if you go back and look at all the anti-corruption demonstrations in Iraq, Syria, the Syrian war started as an anti-corruption insurrection and then turned into a war. So that's another thing, is a lot of these anti-corruption uprisings can spiral out of control into hot wars like Ukraine and like Syria. But I mean, in our case, from the United States, they're coming out of Central America, where all three countries are systemically corrupt. It's impossible to make a living. Not only impossible to make a living in Honduras or El Salvador or Guatemala, but the gang violence that people are running away from is often, the gangs are, how to put it, police are outsourcing their extortion to gangs. So that's another thing that these corrupt networks often have, is criminal or even violent gangs associated with them. Environment, not just carbon. I mean, you have forests here. Who controls what wood gets taken out of your forests? Who has influence over those decisions? I know it feels like you have infinite forests, but you don't. They're precious and they're irreplaceable, and it ought to be, you know, a decision of all of you, the community of Latvians as a whole, how you wish to harvest wood from your forests, by what principles, what are the objectives. I'm not sure that those decisions are really in your hands. And the question is who, you know, who's close to whom, who makes those decisions. And certainly we saw in the Amazon recently how bad that can get. And that's, again, an extreme example of how corruption contributes to environmental devastation, but it can happen here too. It certainly happens in the United States in terms of what public lands are leased to whom, for how much. Let me, if that's not enough, let me add one more, I want to say, really sobering thing that I learned as I was researching this most recent book on corruption in America. I wanted to know, when was the last time that systemic corruption had the same type of grip over, much of the world as it does today? And the period that I came up with was between about 1870-ish and about 1935, or just after the Second World War. And then things changed. There were new regulations and things like that that were put in starting in the mid-1930s across the industrialized world. And what's really interesting about that period that I'm talking about is it's also the period of colonialization in the global South. And so there was a kind of corrupt political economy that was established in the global South, but also what from our perspective is the East. So if you look at some of the scandals in European scandals, a lot of them had to do with railroads across Eastern Europe and things like that. I mean, basically Eastern Europe and into today's Russia was being considered almost like a colony also, where major infrastructure projects could generate outsized stock returns for people who held stock in them. So my question was, what happened to change it in around 1935, 1940, like that? And what I came to was this counterintuitive understanding that a lot of sociologists have come to, that widespread shared calamity often brings people together. So, I mean, look at Ukraine, for example. The war has united. I'm not saying we want war, but war has united Ukrainians in a way that maybe they weren't before the war. Think of a fire or a big flood. People help each other out. They don't ask, what political party they are or what class or what race. And you had, the First World War. How many of you have grandparents or great-grandparents who either died or were displaced by the First World War? None of you? Yeah. Most. Second World War too. But First World War, a third of the population of Latvia was gone. At the end of they were either killed, but of this area, right? Yeah. Second World War, terrible. The Great Depression. Spanish flu, I don't know how badly that hit Latvia, but not so much. No. No statistics. Same as in the United States. In the United States, there was a ban. It's not remembered. My mother is 93. And so she wasn't alive in the Spanish flu. She was born in 1929. But still, I thought, when you were a child, did anyone talk about it? She said nobody, her godmother was a doctor. She said, no one really talked about it. So then I researched it some more. It was banned to even discuss it in the newspapers in the United States because it was going to affect the morale for the war. So we don't even know the effects of the Spanish flu. We don't remember it collectively, but it was huge. It was huge. So what I'm saying is 2 world wars, that's 2 genocides, use of the nuclear bomb, a third of the population of Latvia, 2 or maybe even 3 genocides. I think there maybe was even a third. Mass starvation in Europe, a pandemic that makes COVID look, COVID's getting up there, but, and a Great Depression. What I have found is that the path that we are on today, since about 1980, since about 1990 in terms of, 1980, in terms of financial collapses, in terms of income inequality, in terms of increasingly extreme politics, is almost identical to the trajectory from 1870 to 1935. And if those calamities are what it took last time around, as far as I can tell, we've got the same ones ahead of us. And what are they going to look like this time? So I hate to sort of end on a really dramatic note, but I think this is the most important issue facing our generation. And I don't see that we are as alert to it as people were in the 1870s, 1880s, 1890s. So with that, in case I haven't already answered the question, there was a question that said, why should we as young entrepreneurs care about this issue? So I've got a few questions by way of response. Who is a student here? Raise your hand. Anyone who's a student in one? Just one? Back there? Okay. You had the misfortune to raise your hand first. Why have you decided to go into business?
Basically, build something your own, build by yourself.
Build something for yourself. Okay. In the back. Sorry, say again. Your father's in business. What kind of business is he in? Salt? Chemicals, okay. And I think you're one also. How about you?
I'm not necessarily going to be an entrepreneur. I am working at company, but I think learning the kind of skills we learn, they're applicable not just to create your own company, but if you want to become a mayor, if you want to be a community one. It's leadership outcomes, not only how to money, it's also how to the community work, how to be a politician, because I see it as well applicable. And I wouldn't necessarily say that I would want to be an entrepreneur, but I do see a lot of other places where this can be applied.
Okay. So it's very interesting. I think something that applies to all of you, obviously, but interesting to connect to what you just said. Who are the stakeholders in a business? And are they the same stakeholders as if you're in political office, for example?
Businesses have a lot of impact. Impact the people we serve, impact other companies, they impact the economy as a whole, they impact the politicians, the voters. It's the wide net of connection, a system which perpetuates itself. The government cannot function while completely ignoring the businesses that are functioning in the country. For example, if businesses fail, the whole country is affected. Taxes get raised, people become more unhappy and change their votes, hoping they will make a difference. Governments start raising different issues. So it's all interconnected. And if you're a politician, or if you're a mayor, or if you're just a politically active citizen, it's still very good that you would know how different parts of the system work.
Let me go to you back behind. So for your father's company, who are the stakeholders in that business? Who would you define if you were to list the stakeholders?
Actually, he finished his career because that it happened.
Could I ask you to speak as loudly as you can, because I'm getting a little bit old?
I'm sorry. From my point of view, I guess it's government, society.
The government is a stakeholder in his business. In what way?
Taxes.
Access?
Taxes.
Taxes.
Yes.
Okay, that's interesting. So the business owes taxes.
And of course, my father, because he's a owner.
He's the owner.
That's all.
So how about you? If you were setting up, if you want to make something for yourself, what type of business are you thinking about?
Right now, project which is a historical museum here in Latvia. So, and I think that kind of businesses which provides
A public service.
a public service.
Mhm.
Yeah.
So I guess what I'm trying to invite all of us to think about is the stakeholder can be the business owner, as you suggest. It's also the customers of the business, right? The suppliers who is supplying the raw materials, the community where the business operates, and as you've suggested, the broader community, the country as a whole. So I guess what I'd ask you all to think about is what, bearing all of those stakeholders in mind, what are the characteristics of a good business? In the United States, we have been laboring under the idea for some decades that the only job of a business is to produce returns for the shareholders. Well, not in my view. In my view, a business, as you suggest, is woven into its community. And so if the shareholders are making excess profits, at whose expense? The employees are also stakeholders, which we didn't mention, right? So how are the employees doing? How are the shareholders doing? How is the physical landscape where the business is situated doing? And, you know, the problem with corruption is that it offers counter incentives to doing what you think a good business ought to do. There are counter incentives. Oh, you need to get this authorization, so you buddy up to the so-and-so, or you hire so-and-so's daughter to work in, even though she's not qualified, or, you start taking shortcuts. And by doing that, you start to distort the business environment for everyone, number one. Number two, you cause damage which may not be counted in your bottom line. I mean, I live in a state where one of our rivers caught fire because of the chemicals that had been dumped in the river, right? The company didn't really have to pay very much, but the fish had to pay a lot, And so this quickly becomes an ethical conversation. And that, so what does that expression mean? Yeah. It is. And I guess I would recommend that we all spend the time, go home and spend the time to actually write down what are our main values, and then consider how we are furthering them or countering them in our everyday lives, both as citizens and as entrepreneurs. Are there corners that we're cutting? I mean, I was invited, to give an anti-corruption talk. And I was describing the behavior of the son of President Biden. Have you heard this story where he was on the board of I voted for Biden, okay? So, but nevertheless, I will not defend his son. I will not say that the business model where somebody, the son of the vice president, who has absolutely no capabilities, is getting $50,000 a month from the most corrupt oligarch in Ukraine in an energy company, right? And why is it impossible? So then I would hear, oh yeah, but everyone does that. That's just part of it, What do we shrug our shoulders at? And is there a way we can not shrug our shoulders? So I became not very popular with other people who vote the same way I do, because I was willing to call out Hunter Biden. But I guess I want to leave you with this for now, and I know there's a question right there. What we can do about this. Number one, as I say, take that time to write down for yourself, articulate what your main values are. and then figure out ways in your everyday life and in how you imagine you will play a role in business. How can you use your business organization to further those values? And how can you do as little harm as possible in terms of the externalities that you're creating with your business? That's one. Two, corrupt networks do not take challenge lying down. They fight back. And the number one most effective thing that they do is divide us up along identity divides. And that can be gender, it can be race, it can be east-west, it can be political, whatever the most intense identity divides are in your community. And I suspect here it has to do with Russia and Western Europe is one of them. But I suspect that urban and rural may be another one in this country. It's a big one in a number of countries, including France, where I'm a resident, and also the United States. Don't let them do it. If they are able to divide you along identity divides, and believe me, we get much more excited about our identity affiliations than we do about these issues, which are more important. If they divide it, they've got the power and the money, the corrupt networks. All we have is the numbers. So if they divide us up and have us attacking each other, they win and we lose, period. And a corollary to that, I have found that it is so easy to point at Trump and not point at Hunter Biden. So easy to point at the Russians and not point at the Latvians or the Ukrainians or the Americans. So easy to, or vice versa, right? And I would just submit that there is nothing disloyal in holding your own community up to its highest standards. Start there, because as social animals, which we are, we respond to our peers. When it's the other guy telling us that we're bad, well, that just makes us say, well, I mean, that just gets us all riled up, right? But if my sister or my best friend calls me on something I'm doing, ooh, that hurts. And I think about it and I try to amend it. So our first responsibility, wherever we fall on the political spectrum, on the cultural divide, in your family, in your own business, hold your own peers up to their highest standards. And you have a question.
I like that we were touching, or you were touching now here, the question of values.
Yeah.
Because in my opinion, we have there globally this challenge that we are not doing the abstraction what value means. In terms really, if you take the dictionary, like Oxford Dictionary, there are 5 definitions
Of
value.
value.
Just a word of value, and that's one of the things that if we monetize
Yes,
this term,
exactly.
then this value is highly different than if you're talking about, let's say, values to people and values to societies or even businesses. And one of the reasons why I see there a necessity to understand this abstraction and to work on this much better is because the financial value is the only thing we can more or less count. We can measure it. The other values we are not measuring in terms of, and we consider them as given somehow, and we defend them somehow.
And we don't reward them either.
Yes, as well. And there comes this contradiction when we build the businesses, and actually we put the number as the indicator to be benchmarked with others, which is the easiest one. Honestly, it's the easiest one. Then it creates this not competition but concurrence situation usually. Like the bigger number counts, but the outcome of it's
not measured.
Not measured, and even not sustainable.
And the external damage created is not measured either.
And then that is a point where I think which could be the time span which is coming up, we were describing, where people will start thinking differently about this. Because especially if we have this challenging situations, not only with Ukraine now, but also many others. Like, okay, what is really what we need and what we respect and we would be ready to reward. I mean,
Right.
one of the concepts which are again corruption is like transparency and let's say in the field of innovation, open innovation, which basically means, okay, first of all, we share what we have and then we understand what we create out of it.
Right. Right. So I love that you raised that because I don't know if it's a commonly taught story in Latvia, but do you know the story of Midas? Right. So do you have an expression in Latvian, the Midas touch? No. Good. Good. Because what's crazy is that in American English, the Midas touch has come to mean a positive thing. So, exactly. Wow. So the story is precisely what you're talking about. Midas does a favor for a god, and the god offers him one gift, whatever, one wish, whatever he wants. And he says, I want everything I touch to turn to gold. And the god is not very happy about that, but grants the wish because he promised. And so Midas sits down. He's delighted. He touches an apple. It turns into a golden apple. He touches a sheaf of wheat. It turns into, a golden bouquet. And then it's time for lunch. And he sits down and he suddenly realizes he's about to die because he can't drink anything. You can't drink liquid gold. There's a poetic version that was done in like the 19th century in America also, where the poet gave Midas a daughter. And Midas is very upset as he's horrified he realizes how much danger he's in. So his daughter, who he loves second only to gold, comes running over to him to comfort him, and he kisses her on the forehead. She turns to gold. So it's exactly this, the message of this myth is exactly what you're telling about. This is irreplaceable. His daughter is irreplaceable. It's a value that you cannot count. The relationship. And that's what I feel like we're doing today, is turning everything of irreplaceable value into not gold, not even paper anymore, but zeros. We're turning it into zeros, electronic zeros in bank accounts. And as you say, the danger is that that's quantifiable. And how do you quantify your relationship with your child? How do you quantify the beauty of the forests of this country? How do you quantify, now you hear people talking about ecosystem services, and the ocean provides $7 trillion worth of, like, are you kidding me? No, you can't replace the ocean. Like, you can't, like, if we destroy the ocean, whether you name it 3 trillion or 10 trillion, it's irreplaceable. And that is the danger with money being the marker of social standing. So I thank you for putting this numerical aspect into it. Any other thoughts, sir?
Do you think that each one of us has some sort of corruption in us? And if that's the case, is there a solution ever to corruption?
Does each one of us have some corruption in us? And if so, is there any solution? So my answer is, and I won't quite say corruption. Let me say something a little bit different. And this book of mine about America is very bizarre because not only do I have Midas in it, but I go into evolution. And roughly, very roughly, primates are hierarchical and within some limits. There are some controls on how they function. But the real social revolution that Homo sapiens operated on the primate order was becoming egalitarian. And we did it because we switched our diet to a meat-based diet. And you couldn't hunt the size of animals that were running around this continent by yourself. So you had to hunt in groups, and the best way to keep the group together was to share the meat basically equally. And what's fascinating is that in hunter-gatherer tribes, almost all of them punish meat hogging, so corruption of some kind, almost as severely as they punish murder within the tribe. So meat hogging was an incredibly, I want to say, very looked down on behavior in egalitarian hunter-gatherer tribes. That lasted for about approximately 150,000 years. Then you have various types of more concentrated ways of living. And again, I don't want to be too cut and dried about this, because there are foraging communities that are hierarchical, and there were agricultural communities that were egalitarian. But roughly it starts to change, and increasingly with larger and larger sedentary agricultural communities. That's roughly, 15, 20,000 years. So what I'm trying to tell you is we've got both in our makeup, in our DNA. We have both hierarchical, gimme, snatching everything for yourself as primates. And that's a couple of million years. And we have, 150 or so thousand years of policing an egalitarian order. So we have both tendencies in ourselves. Both come naturally and neither comes naturally, if you see what I mean. And so it's up to us to bring forth the egalitarian, fair, transparent, government in the public service, not in the personal interest. We need to police it. It's there, it's in our genes. But it's not just gonna, and this has been the problem with so many, no, there's some other questions too. I'll come back to you, but there's so many of these revolutions that we've seen, from Ukraine to the Arab Spring to Guatemala to Brazil, where people think as soon as we kick out the corrupt leadership, then, honest government will burst forth. Well, no, it doesn't. You have to police it. So that's another myth that I like to use. Corrupt networks are like the Hydra. You cut one head off and two more grow. So you have to be very clever in how you defeat the Hydra. You can't leave it alone. You have to, and then all of us, all of us are subject to cutting the corners, helping ourselves, doing what's easier. We're subject to it. So that means we need to police ourselves and police our sisters and our family and our business and so on. It's something that communities do. They decide to promote the values of integrity and egalitarianism and to punish self-serving leaders. It's not going to happen all by itself, but it can happen if we decide to do it. I would say that there are some drugs that make it very hard for people who get addicted to those drugs to do this work. One of them is that people get bought incredibly cheap, incredibly cheap. The enablers of the real corrupt networks, they are bought very cheap. And the other drug for everyday people is convenience. How many of you, does Amazon work here? It doesn't. Good. Keep it out. I mean, everybody I know practically buys on Amazon because it's convenient. You need it tomorrow at what cost? At the cost of a monopoly that can affect the functioning of our government, at the cost of labor relations, where people who work in Amazon warehouses in the United States have to wear diapers because they're not given bathroom breaks in the United States. In my state of West Virginia, the average or the typical factory shift is back to 12 hours. We were fighting for 8 hours in the 19th century, and we're back to 12 hours. And for this convenience, people, So I got you, but was there someone else who I thought I saw another hand? No? All right.
Yeah, sorry if I'm.
No. Go for it.
Sorry if I'm now commenting on this. It's a nice fact you're stating. Let's say it's a convenience, which is basically the comfort zone.
Comfort.
It's very interesting because it's one of the reasons why the startup scenes in the last 10 years will fail. Because basically, if you take also the muscle into account, like that you want to develop to a higher level, still you are depending on the basic needs. The comfort zone is exactly in the middle of the pyramid. So that basically means we are stuck into this and we are not developing ourselves, which basically kills our nature. So, this is one thing I've observed, and it's funny is that most innovation activities, for example, are serving the comfort zone because we are creating services where we are not challenging the customer.
I've noticed it walking around town. The number of restaurants, and I get it. This is a beautiful city. I love your city. And so people like me come and, you want to, but a restaurant is a tried and true. It's a kind of comfort zone type of thing. I am surprised. This is also the place where the most beautiful linen on the planet has been produced. And I'm not seeing so much of these things that take long work, and careful work. It's interesting. That's not particularly innovative, how to use linen, but you're right. The services are almost a guaranteed, and services are aimed at keeping everybody else comfortable. Believe me, if you're too comfortable, you're enslaved.
I have two things to add to the previous part of the development. We have two nice indicators that we are developing in the right direction. First of all, when we were living in this Stone Age, so people had only to fight for their food 2 hours or 3 hours a day, and the rest was spare time. We are getting there.
I mean, so yes, but let me just do a little caveat there. It was 2 or 3 hours a day of actually gathering or hunting food, but you're also making the arrowheads, making the arrows and bows, you're making baskets to collect. I mean, there was actually a lot more work, but your point is a good one, that there was a holistic nature of people's lives, and the community life took up a large part of life, and also ritual life, which included a lot of art. I mean, not that much of it has come down to us because most of it has been in imperishable things, but the masks, the costumes, the beautiful implements that people made. I mean, it was a very rich life, and the diet was incredibly rich, also much richer than our diets, much more varied.
And the second point, which is tending to this, is that, let's say, especially the last 20 years have been very supportive that each of us can develop their own personal profile, like getting expert or specialized, which means basically we will increase dependencies, basically.
Exactly.
And that again allows us to find new ways of collaboration, because we are so depending on other people that if we want to make something happen, we need the contribution to others.
Which has its upsides. The idea that you have to collaborate more with other people has some real upsides. But I think we've also all noticed as supply chains have collapsed, in the wake of the war in Ukraine and COVID, that maybe it's a good idea to retain some knowledge and capacities at home, have a little bit of redundancy. There's some value to that. There's another danger of corruption that I didn't mention. I mean, it's a little bit obvious and tender at the moment, but there are countries, Russia being one, China being another, the colonial powers being others in the 19th and early 20th centuries, that deliberately weaponize corruption as an instrument of state that allows them to gain dominant influence, if not total control, of the state that they're corrupting. And I think, just to finish up, the angle is often through business. So you take somebody like Gerhard Schroeder, right? Why is Germany so dependent on Russian gas? You know, because their former prime minister, you know, ended up with a job on Gazprom's board and influenced the energy policy in his country. That has been incredibly damaging
There's
to
another story
Germany's.
too, that we have no fast internet in Germany because his family members own businesses for copper cable.
So there are vulnerabilities. Corruption within a country creates vulnerabilities to foreign countries that wish to influence the destiny of that country. Let's see, so we had others. Economic downturn, corruption increases. Yes and no, sometimes it decreases. Or sometimes the economic downturn creates the conditions that allow, so for example, it was the Great Depression in Europe and the United States that allowed for a lot of the anti-corruption reforms in Europe and the United States, the New Deal in the United States, a lot of labor legislation in Western Europe and all of that. So if the economic downturn is painful enough, sometimes there is a reaction on the part of the population and enough of the leadership actually realizes, uh-oh, if we don't want a revolution here, we better, you know, do some reforms. But it is certainly true that an economic downturn provides opportunities for what you could call vulture capitalists, you know, corrupt vulture capitalists who take advantage of both the combination of the crisis and their friends in government to, for example, snap up assets at a depreciated price. This happened again in the United States after 2008 enormously, where huge real estate purchases were made. And, you know, we had 4 million Americans out in the street, you know, expelled from their houses. I don't know how that economic downturn played out in Latvia. My understanding is I think you guys handled it a little bit better than we did. But so I've done this one. So I can't. I saw that, but I would need to be invited back and do some serious on-the-ground research before I would be willing to make a comment about the Baltic states. I would certainly suspect that Russian influence has something to do with it because it has been an instrument of state, you know, deployed by Vladimir Putin. However, it takes two to tango. So clearly there were people here who were interested in accepting whatever was being offered. And similarly with Afghanistan, where, you know, it's certainly true that the United States had a gigantic impact on how corrupt the government of Afghanistan became. But believe me, the Afghans who were taking the money were corrupt. And the people, in fact, blamed their own government, but blamed us for supporting that government. It was kind of like that. Again, I can't speak from enough. I would like you to answer. Why don't some of you try to answer this?
Well,
Tell me.
you already mentioned one of the aspects, combating corruption, because people don't see any type of results from corruption cases. The general feeling sometimes is that it's just part of basically what we, and a very concrete example actually that came from a representative, the Corruption Prevention Bureau in Latvia, when we discussed, that was 4 or 5 years ago now, we discussed ways to combat corruption better and what's sort of the missing link between investigation, prosecution, and courts, and so which part is sort of lagging behind. And a representative from the Corruption Bureau actually said, look, it's extremely difficult to prove corruption because unless you have a photo of somebody handing an envelope which says
So it's-
bribe on it.
So it's the same issue with the narrowing of the laws. So the point is that the laws, and I spoke to someone after one of these Supreme Court cases in the United States. I spoke to a gentleman who's now in an NGO, but at the time he was in, let's see, he was either in the Department of Justice or he was working at that time in the, I think he was in the Senate, a staff member in the Senate Judiciary Committee. So he wanted to rewrite the law to solve the problem that the courts had found. And so he drafts it and he goes around and shows it to judges and shows it to people who might vote on it. And they were all, instead of talking about what could this law do for the public, they were saying, ooh, well, if somebody had dinner with someone who so-and-so, could they be prosecuted under the law? Everyone was trying to find out whether they would be guilty under this law. And this is the problem with corruption legislation, is the only people who can be guilty of corruption are public officials and business executives, and they're the ones who are voting on the law. And so they all try to make it as generous as possible for themselves. So there maybe anti-corruption law has to be maybe developed by initiative petition, where the people vote on it instead of parliament. Is that possible in this country?
No, what we can vote on, we can create initiatives, what we want the parliament to vote on, but the parliament is the legislator, so people can't. I mean, you can do a referendum,
But it's not binding. Yeah.
Now I have to say, okay, well, I have a bit of policy making background in terms of that. I wanted to learn how it's working in Latvia, and I honestly have to say that you have a lot of opportunities to participate there, as citizen, as organizations, whatever. On the other side, Latvia is a small country, and honestly, it can happen very fast that you can get the impression that something is not going as it should. Also due to the fact that very often you have here the situation that there are opportunities, and the window of other opportunities are closing, so people try to push it through that at least something can be done.
Right.
And considering the last period of the development for the National Development Plan, I have to say that it was very impressive how open the ministries here have been to invite really representatives of the society to participate in the creation of the documents for the next period. And I hope this will continue, because if people would be aware of this, that they can influence and participate in, they are influencing positively. Like
then you have to hold them to it.
Yeah,
Is the point. Like then the point is, laws are nice and they're the prerequisite, but then it's how are they implemented? How much budget is put to the people who are supposed to enforce those laws? What priority is given to prosecute different types of crime? What, I mean, and those are also places where the citizens should really try to push as much as they can.
This was
Yeah.
a question that's kind of
I mean,
to finish up on, I think.
Yeah, how can corruption be removed? I think it takes all of us doing everything, meaning I think there does need to be serious civic demand. And it can be, it has to be persistent, it has to be in your face, like demonstrations and things like that. But as I said before, that's not enough. Then you need to come in behind that with a structure for what is the legal framework that would be needed to protect your society from this kind of corruption coming back. And then you need to have enforcement of that new framework. And that means the citizens have to stay engaged, demanding, not just the law on the books, but the law actually being, and it also means, holding your representatives up to their own promises across political lines, which again, I think may be somewhat easier to do in Latvia. Not quite. I mean, you've got lists, which is the problem, but at least you can do plus and minus on individuals. So if you see an individual on a list that has been involved in dishonorable or dishonest public search, put a minus and tell your friends to put a minus. At least let that individual be sanctioned for what they did. And if you see somebody who really is acting in the public interest, give them a plus. I mean, I know you're still stuck in a single list, but sir, you're going to finish us up?
Oh, I'm American.
Oh, gosh. Uh-oh.
Um,
So have I been holding
not
us
too,
too high account?
no, I have a question. You're talking about currency. And I think I was going to say, isn't something that's even much more valuable than the currency nowadays is influence? And
So not really. I think today, this is what gives you influence. Money gives you influence, and people are spending their influence to get more money. Whereas I mean, it's a great question, and I've thought about it a lot, but I actually think that in the period from about, as I say, 1935-ish to about 1980, people spent money to get power. Like public service was what you were admired for. And so people like the Kennedys, Joe Kennedy, spent money so his son could be president. When Joe Kennedy, this is President John F. Kennedy's father, who was a crook, I mean, but when he was younger, all he wanted was to increase his money. But by 1960, he saw that the kind of culture had changed. So now he was spending money to get his son into public office. I think that since 1980, we've flipped back again, where now people get into office in order to make money,
okay.
not the other way around.
So let me give an example then. So let's take the Hunter Biden,
Yeah.
the laptop thing. So Elon Musk has recently released some emails from Twitter people. And there's also some other stories now about. So if we look at that, there were various former government officials that were on the boards or on the, what do you call them? The truth commissions or the censoring commissions of Google, Twitter, Facebook, that influenced suppression of those stories. I mean, that's the allegation, let's say. So they got influence from that because coming up to the election, that would have been damaging information. I don't know who would still have got Clown in office instead of Biden, but so that isn't that influence?
Yeah, well, yes, but that's a specific example in a
Revolving door.
specific, no, but in a specific, very specific.
Yeah.
So I'm not saying that these things are across the board always true every single time.
Mhm.
I'm saying the bulk of what,
Still
also, yeah. Also clearly, the Ukrainian energy company was looking for influence.
Yeah.
But they were looking for influence in order to continue making money.
Yeah.
So that's,
It
I
all
mean,
comes
this is
back
a
to money.
that's a very specific.
Follow the money.
Yeah. Yeah. All right, ladies and gents, it's time. Is there any booze back there?
Yeah.
I mean, I had some booze already,
Yeah,
but
so, yeah,
wait,
so-
I'm going to
so-
collect. I
so-
hate to do it, but let me collect my.
Time is up. But we should show our appreciation with a round of applause and thank you.
Thanks for coming out. It's a cold night and you have enough words to absorb in your life. So I really appreciate that you're here. Ah,
we're going
she's
to-
really making me pay for my,
We're going to one.
oh. How am I holding up? Thank you. No, seriously, I have to say that writing on corruption in America was the most difficult thing I've ever done. I knew what I would find, but I didn't know how much of it. I was physically ill. I was physically ill in the writing of that book. And and it really took a while to recover, or even, to actually hit bottom, if you will. Thank you, sir. And I actually hold up by not only doing this, it's actually, I'm talking about your forests for a reason. We also have spent way, way, way more of our history in very close interaction with the rest of the natural world. And we have only extracted ourselves in the last couple hundred years, and our bodies, our minds, our souls need that interaction with the rest of the natural world. And we need to love it and care for it and tend it. And so that's what I'm doing. I live in a very wild place, and I don't have a garden. I tend my wild trees like that. And that's where I get some, but that means again that we have to defend it. So I would urge you all to find a tree in this town, if you live in this town, a single tree that you love, that you really love this tree, and visit it at least once a week the way you would visit a friend, and just hang out with it and ask what it needs, and it's great.
Okay, so I should say thank you to also to Riga Business School and the marketing department represented by Elizabeth there for their efforts organizing and doing this. I'll get up and use this room. Thank you, Delna, for bringing Sarah to us. Our director is up there in it, so you can. So what I really want you to do, I want to thank again. I noticed you used she has a little
Notebook.
notebook. Well, we now have
A notebook.
a Riga Business School.
Excellent.
That would be
Thank
for you
you.
to take
I'm
with you.
very much a notebook user. Thank you very
That's
much.
cool.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I really love all of you to stay now.
Yeah. Let's
Back
hang
to
out.
The president's room here. And we
Great.
can chat, have a coffee and some snacks.